All righty. Blessings, friends, and as we get started this morning, I would just like to extend a welcome to our friends who are watching this sermon at a later date on the recording. And I pray that as you watch this message, may the Spirit speak afresh to you through the words that are spoken here today. And grace and peace to you all. Now, as most of you are probably aware, in the time that Cassie and I have been here, you're probably aware that I'm a little bit of a nerd. Well, maybe a lot of one. And this past weekend was a particularly good one for me. That was mainly due in part to the highly anticipated, well, at least by me, the new series on Disney Plus, which is titled Kenobi. It's a new Star Wars show for those who are unfamiliar with it. And it follows the Jedi Obi-Wan Kenobi, who's always been a favorite of mine. And when we first meet Obi-Wan on Tatooine in A New Hope, he's this old, mysterious guy. He's a master to Luke as he sets out on his journey to defeat Vader and the Death Star. But where Obi-Wan really shines as a character is in those ill-fated prequel movies. That's where we really fall in love with this character of Obi-Wan Kenobi. And this new TV series, it's seeking to bridge the gap between those two chapters. The young Obi-Wan Kenobi with the old master that we meet in A New Hope. And to show what happens during those 18 years or so that Obi-Wan spends on Tatooine. And so far, with the first 2 episodes now released, the series is shaping up to be a really good show. And it's promising some really big reunions between Star Wars characters. Particularly, in the second episode, they're really hinting that Obi-Wan and Darth Vader are going to square off again. Now, the last time that this happened in Star Wars, it didn't go so well. Vader versus Kenobi, that is. In arguably one of the best scenes from the prequels, Obi-Wan and Anakin, they're locked in this epic duel of good versus evil, Anakin having turned to the dark side, and that's really broken Obi-Wan's heart. After all, Obi-Wan was the man who trained him. He taught Anakin how to become a Jedi. And Anakin, he was the chosen one. He was, in the Jedi Order terms speaking here, he was supposed to be the one to bring balance back to the Force. And in turning to the dark side, Anakin has failed in that vocation. As Obi-Wan so famously put it, you were supposed to destroy the Sith, not join them. And in that failure of vocation, that failure of Anakin to be who he was truly meant to be, it ultimately led to his downfall. And to bring it back to us here today, that's not unlike our own Christian walk. We can find a similar truth there. Not to say that there's a whole lot of Christian themes in the Star Wars universe. What I more mean to say is that there's a danger that comes with a failed vocation. Back to Star Wars, Anakin, he was this highly trained and gifted Jedi. He was the most powerful of all the Jedi. And as the chosen one, he was called to bring balance back to the Force. But rather, he turned to the dark side and instead used that same skill, rather to bring balance, he used it to wipe out the Jedi and bring tyranny to the galaxy. And as we will see as we dive into this text this morning, we as the church are called to learn the skills that are associated with the church, the characters and attitudes of Christ, and to, by this way of life, embody God's good, sovereign rule here on earth, and fulfill our own vocation as his followers. But when we fail in this, when we follow false teachers or give worship to demons, then as we're going to see this, as we open up this letter together, there are consequences that come from those choices when we make them. So let's dive back into our text for today, and just as we get started, I want to reread our passage for us, the letter to the church of Thyatira. So I'm going to grab my Bible, and I'm just going to read our text again for us real quick. So, allow me just to read it once more for us this morning. It goes, "Write to the angel of the church in Thyatira and say, here is the message of the Son of God, who has eyes like a burning flame and feet like burnished bronze. I know all about you and how charitable you are. I know your faith and your devotion and how much you put up with. And I know how you are still making progress. Nevertheless, I have a complaint to make. You are encouraging the woman Jezebel, who claims to be a prophetess, and by her teaching she is luring my servants away to commit the adultery of eating food which has been sacrificed to idols. I have given her time to reform, but she is not willing to change her adulterous life. Now I am consigning her to bed, and all her partners in adultery to troubles that will test them severely, unless they repent of their practices. And I will see that her children die, so that all the church realizes that it is I who search heart and loins, and give each one of you what your behavior deserves. But on the rest of you in Thyatira, all of you who have not accepted this teaching or learned the secrets of Satan, as they are called, I'm not laying any special duty, but hold firmly to what you already have until I come. To those who prove victorious and keep working for me until the end, I will give the authority over the pagans, which I myself have been given by my Father, to rule them with an iron scepter and shatter them like earthenware. And I will give him the morning star. If anyone has ears to hear, let him listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches." May the Lord bless this reading of his word today. So again, as we approach a text like the one we just read together, one of the things we're tasked with is understanding it as the original hearers of this letter would have. Thyatira may be unknown to most of, I'm assuming most of us today, but it was a relatively well-known city in the ancient world. Not as famous as, say, in Ephesus or Pergamum, but rather Thyatira, it was known as a sort of working-class town. The city was regarded for its smelting work with copper and with bronze, which were important commodities in the ancient world. And with that industry, it brought with it trading guilds and merchants to that area. And similar to how today we see towns pop up around areas where natural resources are rich, such as the gold rush or more recently the oil boom up north. So it's within this kind of mercantile industrial setting that this church has erupted. And as Jesus, he's describing it in these first few verses of the letter, he really has nothing but good things to say about it. Like all the letters that we've looked at so far in this series, Jesus starts by saying that he knows this church. And after all, these are his people. This is his flock. And as we look at the words that he uses to describe them in verses 19 and 20 and so on, he uses terms like charitable. My translation says charitable, which could just be easily translated as loving. He says they are faithful, and he says that they are patient. And more than that, Jesus also says that they're growing in these areas. This is a church that is increasing in the characteristics of Christ. And that's a good thing. If you think back a couple weeks ago, when we started this series, we started by looking at the church in Ephesus. This is the first letter in Revelations 2. And that church in Ephesus, they were all work but no love. That was Christ's complaint against them, that they had forgotten their first love of Jesus. But this church here in Thyatira, they're rather a model of what Christ-like love should look like. But this desire to be loving and patient has, in some sense, resulted in them being hesitant to take any action. It's as though they wanted to avoid confrontation, but in doing so, they've let a danger come into their midst. Because at the center of this letter from Jesus, his main complaint is about a figure which our text describes as a false prophetess called Jezebel. Now, the text doesn't really give us any hints as to who this figure might have been, but there's a couple things that we can glean from it. The fact that was considered a prophetess means that she was considered to have some level of authority within this church. She was a leader, if just not of her own little sect here. But more than that, she's given the name of Jezebel, which was probably more of a designation than her actual name. It's similar to how last week, when we looked at the church in Pergamum, the letter talked about the followers of Balaam. And the similar thing is happening here with Jezebel. Jezebel is an Old Testament reference, but it's not a good one. Jezebel was the wife of King Ahab. You can read about them in 1 Kings. And they were probably one of the most famous of Israel's royal couples, but for all of the wrong reasons. King Ahab and Jezebel were known for their wickedness. And Jezebel, she was a key part in this. Because you see, Jezebel was a Moabite, Ahab an Israelite. And she introduced into Israel the worship of the Moabite god Baal. And with that came all the ritual practices that were associated with the worship of Baal, meaning live sacrifice and sexual worship, something that Jezebel was known for. And so this so-called prophetess in Thyatira was following in the same sort of pattern. She was following in the pattern of Jezebel. She was bringing into the church pagan worship practices like eating food that has been sacrificed to idols and sexual immorality. These kind of practices, as we saw last week, they were common in the surrounding culture of the time. In cities like Thyatira, this would not have been out of the ordinary, but it was certainly not found within the church, even the early church. And it all goes back to how and what you worship. In a city like Thyatira, food sacrifice was to idols of the regional gods or deities. That was a common practice. Nobody would have batted an eye at it. It was the primary way that you communed with your God, either to petition him for a blessing on your business or to celebrate a success. You sacrificed food to your idol, to your God, and you ate it, and that brought you in communion with that God. And the same was true regarding sexual immorality, or those various kinds of sexual practices. Temple prostitutes were an everyday thing, and it was a reflection of the religious expression of those gods, such as Baal or Aphrodite or Athena. But as I said last week, these practices, these things, they were not neutral. We might read of this today and think, wow, that's kind of strange or bizarre. Why did they think that? And we could just chalk it up to superstition. But nobody in the ancient world would have thought that way. The people in Thyatira would have genuinely believed in what they were doing, in worshiping and doing these practices. They believed that it put them in direct access with their gods. And so this prophetess Jezebel in the church in Thyatira, she's wanting to bring that kind of worship into the church, blending the worship of other gods into the life of the church. That, along as with plunging the secrets of Satan, as our text says, thinking that this way of worship can unlock some kind of deeper, hidden spiritual insight for the church. But as I've said before, this is not how we worship God. The people of God are meant to be an alternative community. They're meant to look different than the world that's around them. They're meant to reflect the character and the holiness of God, and it doesn't look like this. God is not honored by this kind of living or this kind of worship. Rather, it's a dangerous thing. When we give our worship to improper things, we, in a sense, we hand over authority as God's people and we give it to the idols. We give it to the demons instead. And that kind of life, it has consequences as it moves us out of God's camp and into the camp of the enemy. Because our worship of God, it shapes us into the image of God. In idolatry, it does the same thing, but it does so in the opposite direction. Now, I know I've said this a couple times already this morning, but in a lot of ways, what we're covering today is very similar to the letter that we looked at just last week. And that, my friends, is not necessarily a bad thing. These two churches, Pergamum and Thyatira, they were separated by geography, but at the same time, they're facing very similar issues. And that, in a sense, gives me hope. Because many churches of our day, we all face similar challenges. And it helps to know that we're not going it alone. Just as in the days of the Galactic Empire, when two Jedi met each other, they'd take heart because they knew they weren't the last of their kind. But both of these churches, they're in the similar situation. They're in the situation of trying to be God's distinct people. While they are simultaneously voices saying that they should be more like the world that's around them. And they're in that tension of who they'll be conformed to, how to navigate this. There's voices saying, oh, it's just a little bit of meat that's been sacrificed to Zeus. It shouldn't matter. Or that we should be doing as the Romans do, if you know what I mean. There's grace. There's freedom. We're forgiven, and so what? But rather, it should matter. It should matter just because people don't sacrifice. It should matter even today. Just because people don't sacrifice meat for a corporate advantage or sleep with a temple prostitute so that their wife is fertile doesn't mean that these idols don't still exist in our world today. And people still chase after them. People still pay homage to these gods they still pay homage to these gods, and they still worship them. And there's still worship even today. The god Ares, I'm sure, is still alive in some North American churches, as well as Aphrodite or Zeus. But the Church of Jesus Christ is meant to be different than the world that's around us. Our behaviors, our beliefs, our worship should be different. Because it should be informed and reflective of the God that we are worshiping. As I've said several times now, what and how we worship, that has an effect on us. Our being informs our doing, and that in turn informs our being. It's a cycle, but let me explain. Say our God is Aphrodite, the god of lust and beauty. Then that becomes our aim. And our worship then becomes reflective of that aim that we have. And then we, in turn, become more lustful ourselves. The same is true with, say, Ares. War and violence, that becomes our aim, and our worship kind of takes on that theme, and we, in turn, become more violent people. But we are in the church, and the church is called to live a different way. We say that those gods are not worthy of our worship, but rather God alone, as we were created in his image to worship him and to become more like him. So that's why these practices, that's why these teachings by Jezebel would be so harmful to the church because it distorts this ability within us. It robs us of our ability to reflect God's image as we give that over to those idols. Jezebel, the original one in 1 Kings, she introduced Baal worship into Israel. And that ultimately led to their destruction as they could no longer fulfill that vocation as God's alternative community within the wider world. So that is what I mean when I say that it's destructive. That's how it's harmful to us as the church. And while we need to make sure that, we're being loving and patient and faithful people, that's all really good things. Don't mishear me there. We must also be aware of the thing that we worship and make sure that that thing always comes back to Christ. That's why, at the end of this letter, it's a call to repentance. It's a call to move back into the camp of Jesus. He says to those people who have followed the prophetess Jezebel on this path that she's brought them on, that there will be consequences to this choice. That this kind of idolatry, it has repercussions. Jesus isn't just going to magically save them from that. It's like when you put your hand on a hot stove, you're going to get burned. Sin hurts us. But at the end of the day, what Jesus wants to see from this is these wayward people to turn back to him. That's what repentance means. He wants them to abandon their idols, to give up these sexual practices, to stop searching the depths of Satan because there isn't anything there anyways, and to make Jesus their object of worship again. The people in this church that haven't taken the wrong turn, Jesus tells them, you're good. There's no need to worry. But for those of the ones that have become followers of this false prophetess, Jesus is saying to them that you need to be my followers again, to make me your object of worship, and not just half-heartedly either. Jesus here, he uses the language of heart and mind. My translation is a little weird and it uses the word loins, but it means the same thing. Jesus is saying, you need to give me the access to those areas of your life, your heart and your mind. And that comes back to that being cycle all over again. To make Jesus our object of worship, we make him our end goal. And then our worship of him is both fully mind and heart. And then when that's in place, then we will succeed at our vocation of being his people. Live out well those characteristics of his church, being loving, faithful, and patient people. And we will do them to such a higher degree because we are doing them in the likeness of Christ. That's the kind of life that we, as the people of God, are called to. I started off this sermon by talking about one of the things that I love, namely Star Wars, and the tragedy that is contained within it, namely the fall of Anakin. And it was due to his failure of vocation. He, as the chosen one, he had the capacity to bring balance to the Force, to save the galaxy. But he gave that authority away to the dark side. And it brought destruction not only to the galaxy, but to Anakin as well. The vocation for us as Christians, it's to bear the image of God, to reflect Jesus out into our world, and through our actions help to build the kingdom of God. But as we have been saying this morning, idolatry distorts this. It tarnishes this ability within us. My friends, when the church does this well, when we live this out, amazing things are possible. We were created for this end. We were created to be image bearers. And when we live fully in that kind of life is something that lasts into eternity. As we live out a Christ-centered, holy living, we're beginning to live lives of new creation. Lives that demonstrate and point towards that good rule of King Jesus. And begin to make that a reality in the here and now. We not only reflect Jesus' character, but also his function as the one who sets things to right. And that's what those final 3 verses of our text are talking about. They're saying that when the people of God are being faithful to our call, we not only act more like Jesus, we be more like him in relation to community. We begin to be people of justice, to begin to be people of reconciliation, of mercy. We are participating in his setting the worlds to right. And that's what Jesus is going to do at the end of things, and we can begin to do in the here and now. That's what it means to live out our vocation as the image bearers of God. And that comes by loving God with our hearts and with our minds and through proper worship of him. And so my friends, just as I wrap up for today, I want us simply just to spend some time of reflection, spend some time in prayer. We're going to listen to another song, and I think it's one that most of us here know pretty well, and it's called Refiner's Fire. And I selected it because the chorus of it goes, Refiner's Fire. My one heart's desire is to be holy. And I pray as we sing those songs that it wouldn't just simply be words that we say because they're up on the screen, but rather because that's our heart's prayer. That God would refine us, that fire would cleanse away any idols that we have hidden there, any sin buried deep, so that our desire, our aim is to be holy, to be like Jesus. That in our lives and our hearts not reflect out to the world, more sin and more brokenness, but rather we would reflect out towards its true nature. And that true nature is Jesus, because that is what our world truly needs. That's what all creation was created to reflect. And we as the church are called to announce that, to bring true worship of our God out into our world. It's just so as we sing together, I encourage you to just spend some time in prayer, to connect with God wherever that's best for you, whether that's at your seat, or you can move about and use the space. You can come up to the mercy seat and pray if you want to. Just wherever you best connect with God. I just encourage you to do so as the song plays, as the words are up on the screen. But simply allow God this morning to refine us, all of us, of any idols we hold in our life, any false worship we've given, and simply by his fire, by his Spirit, by his holiness, conform us into his image this day. So my friends, may the Lord bless and keep you. Let's sing together, Refiner's Fire.